Life, like birth, takes time. It has a long stage of development. Take, for instance, this rose. The actual flower, the rose itself, appears only after a slow unfolding of the bud. And every tiny movement of that unfolding is a moment of development, which ultimately contributes to the glory and the beauty of the full flower. But we never quite grasp this process until it's over. Strangely, unlike life, we humans are anxious and impatient with the process. We're so restless with our beginnings, our smallness. It's difficult to wait, to trust that something good and great will come of all the quiet unfolding, those small, undetected moments of movement in between. There is truly no one who has helped me to surrender and wait for God like Mary. In the past year, there have been several events where, like Mary, I had the opportunity to let go of my fear and allow God to take from my hands what I so desperately wanted to control. More importantly, the letting go, the surrendering of myself, would require that I trust in God's promise to help me and to wait for the unfolding moments rather than to give in to what seemed to be impossible. I'd like to share with you one of those extraordinary events. Last fall, on Saturday, September the 24th, I had 2 weddings on the same day. Now, this is not unusual for a parish priest, except for the fact that they were to take place in 2 different states. The first wedding was for the daughter of my best friend, Jim Seeberger, who had asked me 2 years ago to perform the marriage of his daughter. This wedding was to take place in Baltimore, Maryland, at 1 p.m. in the afternoon. The second wedding was of my nephew, Justin, who had asked me only 3 months before his September wedding to perform the ceremony. And this was to take place in New York City on the same day at 5:30 in the evening. Now, as you can see, it was a very tenuous situation, to say the least, and nobody in their right mind would have said yes to both. But because of my relationship to my friend Jim and my love for my nephew Justin, I felt compelled to say yes. And the only thing that enabled me to say yes was that I moved from my rational mind to my heart, trusting that God would show me the way and enable me to do this impossible feat. The first thing I did was I looked up on the internet to see what the flights were from Baltimore to New York. And to my great luck, there was a flight leaving Baltimore at 3:30 in the afternoon, which would put me in New York at 4:30 and gave me an hour to get from the airport into New York City and to perform the wedding. And I booked the flight. The second thing I did was I called my best friend Jim, and I explained my situation and said, I'll only be able to do the wedding at 1 o'clock, and I will have to leave immediately because my nephew was going to have a wedding at 5:30, and he understood. The third thing I did not do was tell my nephew that I was on such a close call. I simply decided to put it all in God's hands, and the only thing I told him was, trust me, I do have a wedding on that day, but I will be there in time for yours. Now, what you have to understand is, the odds that I was up against was this. First of all, to fly into LaGuardia Airport, you have to have absolutely perfect weather, because it's a very small airport, and if there is any sort of bad weather, all the flights get backed up, and that would have jeopardized my getting to New York on time. Secondly, the distance that I had to cover from the wedding in Baltimore to the airport was 35 miles, which, going 65 miles an hour, would take a half hour with no interruption and no traffic jams. So I flew down to Baltimore on a Friday, and the weather report for that weekend was rain, rain, and more rain. And my heart began to sink. But I continued to say my rosary faithfully all the way down, and at night before I went to bed, and in the morning when I woke up. On Saturday morning, when I woke up, I looked out the window, and the sky was overcast. And even though the night before they had predicted rain, not a single drop of rain had fallen yet. And as the afternoon started to arrive, to my great delight, the clouds started to slowly dissipate. And even though the sun didn't come out, it was clearer skies than what it had been on Friday when I arrived and on Saturday morning. And I was rejoicing. It only made me pray more diligently to Our Lady. The wedding in Baltimore began at 1, and it was supposed to end at 2, but as things go, it ended at 2:30. So now my window was getting much smaller. I had hired a driver to take me to the airport, and he was waiting for me outside. So I ran and I jumped in the cab, and as we were taking off, the sacristan came running out of the church with my cell phone, which I almost left there, which I needed in order to stay in contact with my nephew. As I was driving out the driveway, I rolled the window down the taxi cab and grabbed my cell phone as we continued on our way. To my great delight, there wasn't a single traffic jam in the 35-mile trip to the airport. I got there at 3 o'clock, and my flight was leaving at 3:30. Now, that I still had to go through the TSA and all the line waiting to get up there, but to my great surprise, there was no one in the line, no one. And I simply walked right through, and I got to my gate at 10 after 3. I had 20 minutes to spare, enough time for me to get a cup of coffee. Instead, I said a rosary to Our Lady. I was so full of gratitude. Everything was going perfectly. Now, just before I was to get on the flight, my nephew called me, and he had just found out from his father what was really going on, and he was really frightened, and he was really upset. And I assured him, Justin, don't worry. I know this is hard to believe, but all this is in God's hands, and I promise you I will be there. I'm just about to get on the plane. I hung up the phone. They announced the boarding. I got on the plane. I was in my seat, ready to fly at 3:20. At 3:30, the doors to the plane didn't close, but I wasn't worried. I simply continued to look at my homily for my nephew's wedding. A woman who realized that I was a priest because I was dressed in clerics turned to me and asked me what I was doing because I was looking at the homily. So I proceeded to tell her about this incredible story, this daring feat that I was about to pull off. And she rejoiced with me. Well, now it was 3:40, and the door to the plane had still not closed, and there was no indication that we were going anywhere. Well, as you can guess, I began to sweat. I mean, really sweat. At 3:45, the pilot came over the intercom and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have some bad news." I have been a pilot for Southwest Airlines now for 15 years, and this has never happened before. But the baggage claim department has completely shut down at BWI, and there are no bags yet on this plane, and we cannot leave until the plane receives the bags going to New York. I was so crestfallen. I was so in shock that my head went forward and it hit the leather seat in front of me. And I was saying over and over again, Mary, Mary, how could you? How could you? The woman next to me leaned over and said, Father, it's God's will. Now, I don't mean to say this, but I have to be honest. I wanted to slug her. She was no help at all. I continued to turn my head away and to look out the window. I was ready to cry. But to my great surprise, what did I see when I looked out the window? But here was the baggage cart coming with the bags to load on the plane. I turned to the woman with a big smile and I said to her, look, and I took her head and moved it over toward the window and said, that's God's will. 10 minutes later, the plane left. Instead of arriving at 4:30, which I had hoped, we arrived at 5 o'clock. I got on in the cab that was waiting for me. I had another driver waiting for me. I arrived at 76th Street and Park Avenue, where the wedding was going to take place, at 5:30 on the dot. When I got out of the car, someone came and grabbed my bag, someone put a microphone on me, and I walked in as if nothing had happened, and everything went smoothly. I can't tell you how grateful I was to God. After the wedding was over, I walked down and outside, and I began to cry with such joy. And I can tell you that I know the joy that Elizabeth felt when Mary greeted her. And I know the joy that Mary felt when it suddenly dawned on her at that moment that God was fulfilling his promise to her because it was being validated by Elizabeth. And I know the joy that her heart that led her to sing that Magnificat. My soul magnifies the Lord. She was so overwhelmed with gratitude for the God who loved her. And I was so overwhelmed with gratitude for the God who had brought me safely through this incredible feat and enabled me to marry two people whom I loved very much. And I'm telling you, my heart sang for days. For days. We learn from Mary really what it means to surrender in total trust to the God that loves us.